Thank you. Thank you so much for having invited me in Seville. I will speak in English, so please, if my English is not clear enough, please let me know. I will try to go slower. I'm very grateful to the organizing committee and to Montse for this wonderful presentation. And I would like to present an opportunity to look at the Mediterranean Europe towards its easternmost part. That is the perspective of the Adriatic Sea, in a way. Okay. Thank you. What my presentation is about. My aim, which is to present a work in progress, is to outline merchant practices and institutional control in Venice as a still very important Mediterranean hub. The aim is to assess how specific Mediterranean trade institutions adapt or not, and if not, how and why they enter into conflict with a really fastly changing economic context. Of course, the Venetian case study is a case study that relates mostly to the Mediterranean than to the Atlantic, which is one of the main topics this series of conferences deal with. However, the Venice is not disconnected from these Atlantic flows because, and that is why I believe, and not only me, of course, that is why the 17th century Venice is so interesting, speaking about institutions. A lot of a great part of its merchant community has to do with the Atlantic flows, has to do with the Spanish empires, at least in the second half of the 17th century, and has to do with the growing circulation of goods around the globe. So I will briefly speak about that later, but even if Venice, it is defined with its history of decline, early modern Venice is something very different from the glorious, triumphant Venetian Empire of the late Middle Age. But at the same time, the city is still vibrant, and it is still vibrant because of its merchant community, which is not composed anymore of Venetian patriciate, but instead of foreign merchants. And of course, the problem is that the economic institution of the city remains traditional, remains made for the patriciate. So how do these new communities of merchants, how do they discuss with the Venetian government? So there are old institutions and new practices of conducting negotiation with the central government. This is the object of my ongoing research. Of course, we all know what institutions are about, and early modern institutions, according to the historiography of the last 30 or already 40 years probably, organization of the early modern trade revolve around substantially three kinds of, let's call it institutions, kind of trading organization. The first one are the merchant guilds. The merchant guilds are corporative institutions that group wholesale merchants, and they are often considered as regulatory institutions.
Puoi parlare in italiano anche?
Davvero?
Sì, se vuoi parlare in italiano.
Sì,
ma no.
ma forse la gente lo capisce. In inglese capisce che c'è.
Better in English, so anyway, thank you.
I can translate for you.
Thank you. Merchant guilds usually limit the number of participants, and somehow they are considered, they block, some scholars think they have blocked the emergence of free markets, of course. They are not so common in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, not so common in the Italian peninsula in the early modern age, not even in the whole Mediterranean Europe, even though there is the statute of the Bilbao Consulado, who are a case in point for merchant guilds. Much more frequent are the merchant communities, the nationes, nazioni. The merchant communities are a mercantile group of people bound together by political institutional norms. They are bound by a shared geographical origin. They very often have a common sovereign, the same religion, very often a common language, and very often they share the same cultural norms. For instance, the Florentines in Venice are a merchant community, are a nation, the Florentine nazione. Of course, in polycentric states as Spain, these communities can be composed of different nationalities, but this is a specific case and does not apply to the Italian city-states, of course. So merchant communities are a kind of regrouping merchants that are very common, and they act sometimes as a unique force, but sometimes not. But anyway, if merchant guilds are not common in Italy at this time, in early modern Italy, merchant communities are, and cities, the governments of cities do relate with them. And the third kind of trading institutions, the historiographic literature on institutions considers, are social networks. And again, we all know what social networks are. They are defined sets of people, sets of groups linked to one another by specific relationships. The relationships that connect people in a network can be tangible or intangible. And about the tangibility of relationships, we might discuss a lot, but more or less we all know what we are talking about. Of course, there are debates around the force of these different institutions. Debates depend on the approach the scholars have on them. Avner Graef is one of the scholars relying more on anthropological consideration of these institutions, and he believes, very generally speaking, he believes that these groups create their own rules, they create their own laws. A more neoclassical approach, as the one of Schilag or Ogilvy, instead put a lot of attention on the real institutional part, norms, codes of law, notaries, the judicial codes, and the like. Of course, everyone dealing with with archives knows very well that probably both of these approaches were true. So there were specific norms a merchant community had, and there were as well the rules of the law that the city in which these communities worked decided to apply. So probably the key to a successful economic exchange is, of course, an impartial, efficient, third-party agency, as the economists like to call the rule of law, but also the existence of a level of trust or another similar self-enforcing institution. Trust very often is linked to reputation. Reputation mainly has to do with being able to repay credits. So reputation is a kind of social norm acting in the mercantile community, but has to do with a very specific financial strength, a very specific financial capacity. I move on. Okay. So in the case, what I see in Venice is that networks probably are the most effective way of interpreting how business is done in a city port of the 17th century Mediterranean. In the Venetian case study, merchants rely on their social networks. Of course, they belong to merchant communities, but sometimes they decided to act individually. It depends a lot on the merchant community in itself. The Dutch, for instance, decided to go all together. They petitioned a lot, as the English merchants in Venice. They petitioned a lot, and they asked a lot to the Senate. They act as a compact group. The Genoese and the Florentines, instead, they go ahead in a sparse order. They go ahead individually. They decide to ask something directly to one senator or one very influential patrician on their own. So merchant communities are recognized, they apply, they are recognized as such, even on behalf of the government. But at the same time, and at least this is my impression, really the network, the capacity of building personal relationships counts as much in having a successful relation with the government. In any case, as in many other places, the courts of law, the tribunals are really the last instance resort. Merchants try as much as they can not to go to tribunals, not even if they are risking losing anything. They try to manage between themselves any controversial issue. Why is Venice still so important? We know that the 17th century has long been interpreted as a period of crisis, a period of decline for mature economic systems as the ones of the Italian peninsula are. And particularly in Italy, because Italy was one of the leading countries in the so-called commercial revolution of the Middle Age, like Flanders, really. But more recently, the concept of decline has been replaced first by the idea of a general crisis, and I refer to the studies of George Parker. And this general crisis was felt by some European areas exactly when other countries were beginning to show a more dynamic growth rate. But more recently, again, this concept of crisis and decline has been profoundly challenged because the paradigm of crisis for Southern Europe depends on the emergence of new economic and more powerful economic trends in the northern areas of Europe that definitely at the end led to the industrial revolution. If we get out from this paradigm, there are a lot of data that instead talk about vitality, a very active tentative to stop these challenging trends. It is true that for Venice, the two periods between the still glorious 16th century and the glorious in other respect of the 18th century, between these two different Venices, we might say, there is what an important historian of Venice has written. There is an irresistible downward slope in the 17th century. However, the research that has been conducted over the last 30 years has, if not completely overturned, at least mitigated such a pessimistic view, highlighting above all the cultural vitality of the city, a vitality of theaters, music, literary academies, works of art, works of literature, a still vibrant publishing market, but also its strong economic and financial resilience. The downsizing of this commercial space, which the 20th century historiography believed took place around 1650, when the Mediterranean area, ruled by the Italian commerce in a way, was transformed into a trading area for simply locally produced goods, particularly raw materials for manufacturing in continental and northern Europe, has been strongly challenged. You know that the paradigm was concentrating in simply basic production in the primary sector, a decline in production of high quality goods, and a takeover of maritime transport in the Mediterranean by the northerners. All three aspects are true. But at the same time, it is now impossible to say that 17th century Italy, and this applies for any of the northern and central city centers, it is impossible to say that 17th century Italy is in decline, at least until the end of the century itself. And if we look at the commercial institution of the city, all of them rely on the medieval expansion. This map simply refers to the different phases of expansion of the city that conquers quite a vast part of the actual Veneto and Lombardy in the 15th century, but already had a stronghold since the 13th century in the main Greek and actually Turkish island in the Eastern Mediterranean. The supremacy of medieval Venice was based mainly on three factors: a very strong public interference, because throughout the Middle Ages and the early modern times, the role of the Venetian government was that of a government facilitating international trade. And it was not limited to providing suitable laws, a suitable environment capable of protecting the basic rights of merchants. It also intervened directly in the conduct of trade, both by setting a precise direction for the routes, the timetables of traffic with the Levant. There were um, 5, 4, 3 times a year departures at a regular time, and this factor gave a rhythm to the market, even to the financial market. Moreover, the members of the government themselves were completely involved in trading. So there were several incentives for Venetian citizens, and particularly for the patriciate. The patriciate was, from the late 13th century, a closed class, and it was the complete manager, we would say, of the government. There are a famous phrase by Frederick Lane saying that the Senate acted as a business committee in a way, and this was completely true. Incentive for the Venetian patriciate was applied mainly in the convoys of galleys. Galleys are quite fast ships. They were built in the public arsenal, and the convoys permitted to hold at a lower level the protection costs that were necessary for trading, especially towards the Eastern Mediterranean. Galley convoys ensured a reliable, regular departures, a constant and secure flow of information, a protection for the most valuable goods, and trade was quite secure. And moreover, since the galleys arrived all together with this enormous bulk of goods in the destination ports, the merchants that have charged them could act as monopolists in a way, or oligopolists, because they get hold of the majority of the market. These kind of institutions, public institutions, lost their strength in the 16th century and were finally abandoned. While the trading community, the community of merchants trading with the Eastern Mediterranean, was gradually replaced by foreign companies, that is, non-Venetian companies from territories outside the Venetian state. That means that these institutions and the public offices set to regulate trade were not able anymore to cope with the new situation. And that's why several merchants have to petition to the government, because the government was not able in se to provide laws that could adapt to the new situation. We know that also in the Eastern Mediterranean, with the advance of the Ottoman Empire, but most of all, with the growing competition undertaken by the so-called northern merchants, that the English, Dutch, and to a lesser amount French traders, was the main problem that the Venetian community of merchants had to consider. Moreover, there were quite severe crises in Venice and in the mainland state. The maritime dominion of the city-state was involved in crisis as well, but more related to the military necessity to stop the advancement of the Ottoman Empire. So starting from the late 16th century, the Venetian government had to cope with a lot of different crises involving both its own population in the mainland, the void created by famines and epidemic crises, but as well the necessity to continuously maintain a military force which was paid, because Venice did not have an army or even a naval army on her own. So the city had to rely on conscriptions, but most of all on buying mercenaries, generally from Switzerland and also from the Low Countries, from the Dutch part, the Dutch provinces. And how the merchants managed to cope with this situation? A lot of, as I said at the beginning, a lot of new merchant families and societies settled in Venice from the last quarter of the 16th century. Many, no, not the majority of course, but several of them were able to become so rich to enter into the patriciate after 1646 to finance the war against the Ottomans after a extremely debated discussion in the Senate. The government decided to offer on sale the entrance on the Venetian patriciate. And 2 over the 4 first families to pay the quite huge sum of 100,000 ducats to be part of the patriciate were members of these new families of merchants. One family was the Wittmann from Carinthia, and the other one was the Labia, originally Spanish, but Florentine, actually, since the late 15th century. How do merchants adapt? And I'm going to the conclusion of my paper. I believe that the centrality of the place of Rialto, which is as the Bourse in Amsterdam, was a key for the success of the persistence and resilience of the city in economic terms. The Rialto area was completely destroyed after a fire in 1514. The area was rebuilt in a few years, trying to maintaining the same, more or less the same form, but trying to implement the functional characteristics of this part of the city. The island of Rialto was one of the first part of the city itself that began to increase at the very origin of Venice. And it is the Campo di San Giacomo, this literally a square, in a square form. One of the sides is the Church of San Giacomo, which has an enormous 15th century clock to mark the time of Rialto. On the opposite side, where in this 18th century drawing we can read Banco del Ziro, under this porch there were the banks of Giro, private banks are an institution, a crucial institution for the development of the medieval commerce I'm not dealing into. But the Venetian banks, the private banks, closed one against the other in the second half of the 16th century, and from 1587, the government decided to open a public bank. Initially a deposit bank, where the giro accounts could be also be possible, and from 1618, a more commercial bank, the Banco del Giro, and both of them were just in front of the Campo di San Giacomo. So the merchants could find the banks, the insurance market, all the services they need, the intermediaries, interpretive. They could rent warehouses for an indefinite period of time, and all these small numbers are all shops and warehouses. They were all for rent. Some of them were stable, but the majority of them were all for rent. So they need to be visible at the Rialto. First of all, because this was a functional place in which they could find all they need for conducting their commerce, but also because if they continue to be seen at the Rialto as in a bourse, as in a stock exchange, they could also demonstrate to all the others that they were reliable, that they had still credit, that they conduct the commerce, that they could do the business as usual, let's say. And which was the relation of merchants with the public authorities? There were rules that were learned and acquired by frequenting the Rialto Square. There is a very nice book made for newly arrived German merchants. This book dates from the last part of the 16th century. And the book has the translation of typical phrases to be said in Italian and in German. Where do I find the people making my balls of balle di mercanzia? Where people that can pack my merchandise, sorry, and the like. Where can I find the insurers? Very, very interesting. It seems like these newly arrived merchants learned quite quickly how to behave, and we have a lot of several documents implicitly saying the same thing. They learned how to behave, what to say, at which time do they need it. They need to be at the Rialto, because they were the time of the Rialto. We don't know which was the time, unfortunately, but a lot of documents refer to the time of the Rialto. He was not at home because it was the time of the Rialto, so he was in the Rialto market doing his business as usual. And of course, around this area, there were also the public offices related to commerce. Before the fire of the 1514, so in another economic and political period, we might say, all the fiscal offices were in the Rialto. Along the 16th century, a part of these offices were moved away towards San Marx. From the Rialto to San Marx, you could go by boat. It takes about 10 or 15 minutes. You could go by walking, and the streets from Rialto to San Marx were the first ones to be paved, the first one to be made accessible, and they were the most important in terms of the richness of the shops. However, even in the 16th and 17th century, there were a lot of public offices. regulating in a way the commerce. They were the place for the public, the way of all the merchandise. There were quite a big statue of the justice with a sword in her hand, just down the Rialto Bridge. And there were, behind the Church of San Giacomo, the small office of the Board of Trade, which assumes an increasing importance in the 17th century. Since these merchants very often petition to the government to ask a reduction of their duties, for instance, for a special kind of merchandise or for a newly arriving merchandise as tobacco. They had to ask because the government in itself did not want to prevent them. The government is always on the traditional way of acting. So it is the merchants that ask something and very often obtain something. So this Board of Trade, the Cinque Savi alla Mercanzia, was the connection between these several merchant communities and the ducal palace, we might say. This board had two offices, one just behind the Church of San Giacomo in the rear part of the apsis, and one, a bigger one, let's say, in San Mark's, into the ducal palace. And all along the 17th century, they were able to create a special kind of intermediates. They decided to select from a group of merchants a special figures which were called the capi di piazza, the head of the piazza, and who were changed every 2 or 3 years. The capi di piazza, about them we do not know very much, I must confess, but the capi di piazza were increasingly used to listen to the needs of these merchant communities and report them to the central government. But at the same time, the central government, well, the government in itself maintained a very traditional way of acting. We never did this thing, so we do this time exceptionally, but we never did that, so we cannot start doing that on a regular basis now. And to conclude, so I believe it is this half private order, half public order institution that is sort of a stock exchange in the Rialto is the real mechanism that permits this resilience of Venetian commerce, and not only Venetian commerce, because Venice was very well linked to the German countries, and in the 18th century, as several recent research show, the German countries are really very powerful, very active on the Eastern Mediterranean, thanks to their links with Venice. The Piazza di Rialto, the formal and informal functioning of the Piazza di Rialto permitted the resilience of the Venetian commerce, even in the 17th century, despite everything despite all that has been written about the general crisis and the decline of early modern Italy. What about the public institutions? They did not change. The government remained, in a way, constantly loyal to its tradition. The spine of the Venetian finance was the the duties that were extracted from the commerce, apart from the innovative way of sustaining the public debt. But the government did not change nothing of the way they thought trade. They believed that trade had to be conducted. However, it seems from the official documents that can be consulted, they were perfectly aware of what was changing. They were perfectly aware of what was going on in Amsterdam, in London, in the German countries, apart from all the information that Venice continued to gather and then spread away: political information, cultural information, economic information. They were perfectly informed also on the innovation that some countries decided to adopt. For instance, the Bank of England, they knew that, they discussed it, but they did not change the rules that governed the two public banks of Venice. In the end, I believe that, but this is still my research, that is still ongoing, I would say. I believe that it was this matching between the necessities of trade presented to the public officials by these new kind of merchants, these really new merchants who were not Venetians, so could not apply to have incentives for doing trade efficiently and at a lesser cost, and at the same time a sort of resilience that the government demonstrated without adapting completely, but deciding case by case to accept or refuse the proposal that the merchants presented. And I will be happy to listen to your comments if you have any, and many, many thanks for your attention. Thank you so much.